Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michelle Allendorfer, APSA Senior Director of Teaching and Learning. On behalf of APSA, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on facilitating respectful conversations in the political science classroom. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes from APSA. First, we ask all webinar participants to adhere to APSA's Respect campaign. The Respect campaign encourages professional respect by and towards all APSA event attendees and participants at all times. Respect stands for respectful, equitable, safe, professional, and ethical conduct towards all. The APSA Sexual Harassment Survey Report, Anti-Harassment Policy, and Code of Conduct all address the importance of facilitating a climate of respect at all APSA events, and you can learn more about the Respect campaign and Code of Conduct on APSA's website. Throughout the event today, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions. We will be recording this event and making it available on APSA's website shortly, along with relevant resources, and you can enable closed captioning using the menu option below. We are fortunate today to have with us an incredible panel of scholars and educators. I'm going to introduce our moderator for today's event and then hand it over to her to introduce the rest of the panel. Michelle Deardorff is the Adolph S. Oakes Professor of Government at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Her teaching and research have focused on the constitutional and statutory protections surrounding gender and race, as well as exploring the insights provided by political theory. She particularly enjoys teaching classes and engaging with the public in ways that allow people to apply their understanding of law, politics, and political theory to current events, believing an important role of a university is to foster thoughtful citizens prepared to participate in governing our communities and nation. Very relevant to today's topic. So thank you for moderating today's event, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I think one of the superpowers political scientists have is that we are used to having these complex and difficult conversations in our classroom. For most of us, this is the bread and butter. I teach, civil rights and civil liberties and con law, so I've been advocating, leading discussions on issues like abortion and flag burning, I think, since the very, very early 90s. And so we know how to do this, but it's great for us to come together and kind of share the way we think about things, think of collectively about how we do this and why we do it, and then think about how these skills can be applicable in other places as well. So I'm looking forward, we're gonna have time at the end to have contributions from all of you, but we're gonna start, I'm gonna introduce our panelists, and then we have about kind of 5 questions we're gonna get started with, and then we'll open it up for a larger discussion. Tavishi Bhasin at Kennesaw State University is here. We are also joined by Leah Murray at Weber State University, Verónica Reyna at Rice University, and Ayana Best at Howard University. So we represent a wide variety of institutions, and also we represent states where these conversations are particularly complicated. And so I'm excited for us to begin. So our first question that I want us to think about is, what is the purpose of discussion in your classroom? And I'll give you a brief example. I had a young scholar, young professor who in the early 90s went into his American government classroom with a little personal American flag and flicked his bic, and then was shocked that chaos just, erupted, and that he actually had to dismiss the class as opposed to having a good and thoughtful discussion. Now, we all look at that and think, oh, what was he thinking? What is the purpose of discussion in your classroom? And how do you use these conversations to kind of support larger learning objectives? Tavishi, I think you're going to start with this one.
Gladly. Thank you, Michelle. I just want to start off by saying that I've also been at the opposite end of the spectrum, than this professor, as my first time TAing an American politics class, and as somebody who'd never taken American politics before I was asked to teach, that's always an interesting position to be in. And I was in there and there was no discussion. So that's not great either. So that sort of leads me to the purpose. So what I've learned, over time is engagement. It's really, really important. So there is that goal that having discussion on a controversial topic is important. We want to engage the students, but at the same time, we also want them to learn how to do this well, both as a value, but also as a skill. They have to make arguments in writing and in speech professionally. And the sooner we start with this, the better. And this is the best way I've found to also have them look at the evidence, actually do the reading, come prepared, and then make an evidence-based argument versus one that is just, based on what they've heard in the ether. So I'll stop there and let somebody else pick up. Yeah.
For others of you, what's the role of this discussion, these kinds of discussions in your classroom?
No, I think I would add as well. I feel like I loved your point when you said sometimes there is no discussion. So a little bit for me, I want to say it's warming up the room. Does that make sense? So I do not want to stand there and for 50-minute soundbite or 75-minute soundbite just talk at people. I would prefer there be, because my goodness, it's boring for me too, right? Like if I'm just doing that. So for me, part of it is the warming up of the room, which I think makes everyone comfortable. And then the conversations about the content that you're learning land a little better. Does that make sense? Like, so it's that kind of making everyone open to the learning possibilities, because man, I hate a quiet classroom. I'm with you, right? Just kind of, that's my worst nightmare.
I think also, sorry, I'm so sorry, Verónica.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, I think I found that it can be very productive in setting an environment that actually encourages good, positive, constructive discourse. If we can do this well, it makes students want to come to class, makes them want to speak up, even on difficult subjects, and feel comfortable knowing that it is a safe space to have this open conversation and ask questions that are difficult if we do them well and respectfully.
Verónica, were you going to jump in there?
I wanted to add to that, depending on the demographics of your students or the context of your institution, that having time and space to reflect upon your political opinions or thinking through, partisanship or thinking through your arguments is a privilege that a lot of students don't have. And so being able to incorporate these discussions in your classroom provides that opportunity for them just to take time to think about this, as opposed to their other responsibilities that they're juggling. So that's another reason why it's important for me in my classroom.
I would just add that I remember being, not only a TA, but I also remember being a student. It wasn't that long ago. And I remember not being able to have the open space or the opportunity to share my opinions or feel that they were accepted, because I was often the only woman of color or a Black woman in a lot of my classes, and particularly political science classes. So a part of my role as the professor and the facilitator in the classroom is to create that space where all of my students feel they have the opportunity to share their wisdom and their experience, and not feel that their opinions will be disregarded or shunned, or they won't have the opportunity to do that. And I want to build well-rounded students in my classroom. So giving them that space is the main role that I play in bringing those discussions to them.
And this is a skill. I mean, this is an important civic skill. It's an important pedagogical skill to have. For our students who living in the United States right now, this is not a skill they're taught elsewhere. And so as we move to the second question, one of the things we're seeing is that students are less prepared now for these conversations. I will say I've been teaching over 30 years and they are less prepared now. And I've taught at a variety of kind of open institutions. I like first and second generation students. So they're coming to college. This is the only political environment they know for traditionally aged students. This is what democracy is, what they've witnessed in the last 5 to 7 years. And so it's kind of on us to help prepare them, helping them encouraging intellectual experimentation when they've been taught there's right answers for everything and you have to get the right answer. So we have some real opportunities here. How do you lay the groundwork early in order to facilitate a classroom environment that fosters inclusive and respectful conversations around contentious subjects? How do you do that? How do you get it started? Ayana?
Yes. So I started off even before day one with my syllabus and the creation of an inclusive and well laid out syllabus that states the classroom norms and expectations that I have for my students when we do go into these conversations. And I try to communicate as clearly as possible with them that we will be respectful in this classroom. We will hear different opinions. But that doesn't mean that that gives you the opportunity or the right to be indifferent or intolerant of those different opinions. So making sure that I, on the first day, set clear boundaries, expectations, and norms for my students within the syllabus, have them sign this syllabus so that I understand that you have read it and you agree, and that you know that these are expectations that you agree to. And I also make sure that my syllabus includes a diverse and various range of authors and scholars who discuss these issues in their writing, and they do it clearly, and they do it in a way that leaves space and opens opportunity for diverse voices, including Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, et cetera. So highlighting marginalized scholars who may not be on the traditional syllabus that they would get in political science really opens their mind and their intellectual knowledge about what is political science, what is intellectual scholarship and work, and that they too can do this because they see themselves in the writing and they see themselves in the syllabus that I create. And finally, I open up with the icebreaker in the beginning of the semester. And this icebreaker is to hopefully highlight not only their differences, but their similarities, and help students understand whether they come from places of privilege or not, that they all have similar goals in mind, being educated students. And I do teach at an HBCU, a historically Black college and university. So while many might think it's, all Black students, predominantly Black female students, they have such diverse backgrounds and diverse opinions. So it's important that they understand that, as well as they understand how to navigate those differences in the real world or outside of the college classroom. So bringing in those activities and those icebreakers really help them get to know one another and be able to navigate their opinions and speak clearly to them.
How about others of you? How do you kind of plow the ground ahead of time and make it fertile?
I think the rules of engagement, like Ayana was saying, are really important to make clear, be they for in-person or online discussions. And one thing I found useful is to actually do this with the students, because we do live, like you were saying, Michelle, in an unusually polarized time. And they're used to being mostly in their own echo chambers, right? On social media. So when we have this opportunity, it's nice to actually have them help set what the rules are. I have 6 or 7 things I like to cover. And I find that, if I open it up to them, they will come up with things. And then if they have, they're invested in those rules as well. And so, just making sure that, okay, everyone should speak up, but when you do, you have some evidence to back up any facts or opinions that you are providing. We're actually sticking with mostly facts and evidence-based things we're going to see here. These are the types of places where you might want to find your evidence. There should be reputable news sources. I'll show them the biased map that is easily available, so they know kind of where to look for good resources outside of what we're providing in the classroom. And then, listen carefully, don't interrupt people speaking, and These are just some of the basics that help.
Verónica?
I would add that just as important as having ground rules for having a good conversation and dialogue, it's important to also have in those ground rules a plan of action for when things don't go well. And have them think about how do we bring conversation back to center? How do we calm ourselves down? And come up with a game plan so that they understand that as they're learning these skills, that it can happen. It probably will happen, but you have a plan of action that you're talking about ahead of time before something potentially happens. So I would add in that potentially negative stuff too, so that they have something to fall back on in case that arises.
I think I would add, I totally would echo everything Verónica just said. But for me, it's also, and for me, not but, it is formative discussion practice. Does that make sense? So it's the icebreakers like Ayana talks about, but then also like this week we're going to talk about, like, I don't know, if the Olympics were happening, I might talk about what's going on with like Jordan Childs and her medal. Does that make sense? So it's kind of some, how do I say, low stakes maybe for the content, ways of practicing having these conversations, in a way that maybe not all the feelings are being felt that intensely, and doing that enough over the semester so that the bridges are built so that when you are having, and I love how you started with abortion, right? Earlier, Michelle, like I've talked about abortion since the 90s, but like maybe that's not the first conversation I have. Does that make sense? So having that built in, like a pulse across the semester. So by the time we're talking about abortion or trans rights, right, we all know each other a little bit, and the bridges have been built to each other. The infrastructure, if you will, is available to us to have those conversations.
Another thing to think about is thinking about this curricularly throughout your department, and how do you support each other so that these are skills students are learning throughout the curriculum. One of the things the task force report on rethinking political science education has talked about is how do we think about this not just pedagogically in our own classroom, but curricularly as well. And so in our department at UTC, University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, we created a new curriculum around 2016 because we're a very polarized state, Tennessee, I'm in a progressive city and a very conservative county, and our students are both. And so we actually created a 1 credit hour freshman course for new freshmen, new transfer students, new majors. Everybody takes it. And it's a socialization course. It's not intro to the discipline the traditional way. It's more intro to us. And so they meet all the faculty. And one of the things we talk about is that partisanship is one way, one lens through which to study political phenomenon. And we're going to expose you to lots of lenses, and different lenses bring different aspects of problems to the front. And so we're not going to default to those partisan lenses. And then they start policing each other. And so by the time we often get them in upper division classes, the groundwork's been laid and we can just move ahead. So I do think as a discipline, we need to be thinking about this curricularly and not just pedagogically. So, and I know that can be very complicated in many departments. All right, so let's talk about a specific class. You know that you have a issue coming in front of you. You know there's going to be a difficult discussion to have. How do you react if, despite your best efforts, there's a conflict in the classroom or a student says something harmful? How do you navigate that the students who may be more vulnerable feel supported, but the student who made the faux pas or who became much more aggressive also feels a part of that community, and the learning doesn't stop that day? We don't shut them down. How do you do that? That to me is the dance. Verónica?
Yeah, I think well, it's a wonderful opportunity to model democratic dialogue and emotional regulation. I think you have to first check yourself and not respond emotionally as well. If you're steering the ship, you need to be able to kind of stay in your rational part of the brain to be able to keep that situation under control. It's always helpful to reinforce that disagreement is okay, but if there is conflict, you need to have a plan to de-escalate it and to get us, get your conversation back on track. And I would add that you should trust yourself in your own judgment about safety and kind of the context of power that you're in the classroom and with your students and that dynamic. Sometimes conflict is not something, that happens is not something that's safe for you to try to get in the middle of. If you have, if it escalates incredibly quickly to physical altercations, then, you should probably bring in public safety or the campus police. And not put yourself in harm's way. So you trust your instincts in terms of kind of where that conflict is. But I think, as I mentioned before, having that plan in place and your ground rules for what happens if there is conflict or emotions get a little heightened it's really important to have that plan in place and to practice it throughout the semester. So the minute that you sense that someone's tone is changing or the volume has increased, step in and say, okay, let's practice our regulation techniques. And everybody needs to do this because everyone's going to be affected, not just the, few individuals that are in conflict, because it does disrupt the environment, the learning environment for everybody. So practice those techniques for when the dialogue breaks down and how you should recover. And, whether they're breathing techniques or it's just kind of 30 seconds of no one talking, like whatever the classroom comes up with or whatever you want to interrupt and institute that ground rule. And then when it's time for you to kind of put that education spin on it, fall back on the ground rules. That's why you have them. Remind students what's tolerated, what's not tolerated in communication, and name the action. So, yelling at each other will not be tolerated, or, that name that was used or name calling is not going to be tolerated because it's hurtful and we're not communicating, or, kind of naming that action in a constructive way. And to keep people included and still learning and hopefully kind of back in the rational part of their brain is to then shift that conversation back to that person who got upset or who raised their voice. So, a simple transition can be something like, we want to understand your rationale or your experience or your point better. So when you're ready, please share your thinking and evidence in regard to whatever the issue is at hand. And so, hopefully if you're practicing this, the minute something escalates a little bit more, it's not going to be as threatening as if you already have this huge conflict in place and you've never done any type of de-escalation techniques or anything like that. And students will learn that there is a plan in place, you are practicing it, and that it will remain a safe environment. And so it's these techniques are something that has to be practiced throughout this semester, and students in that trust environment will learn that you will step in and keep things safe for them and conversation productive. So those are just some tips to deal with the kind of the emotions that are going to be heightened. I think it's also really important to reassure students too that as they're learning this, that you will become emotional, right? I mean, so much, we know that so much of politics is emotional reaction. And what you're trying to reinforce is not so much that they should feel ashamed that they're having an emotional reaction, but that they are developing those skills to mitigate it so that they're staying rational and they're applying course concepts or that they're doing active listening.
And I found that discussion about why these are such emotional issues sometimes takes the heat from it. That we acknowledge these because these impact people's lives. These aren't just theoretical issues. These are things that impact people's lives. And so there's going to be emotion attached to it. But I think you're right. How we respond, so many of the students are going to take their cues from us. What else? What other things do you think about these, which is the piece that I think frightens most people when they think about having these debates? I remember the very first class I taught, I had a student who got angry because no one was agreeing with him. So he was a football player. He decided he was going to walk out. I'm like 23. I decide I'm going to block him because we're not walking out. We're going to complete this conversation. And he sat down and we completed the conversation. And so I think having that happen the first time I taught gave me probably foolish courage to realize I can outface them. We can make this work. Doesn't always work like that. Ayana?
Sorry. I definitely agree with everything that's been said by Verónica. I would add thinking about how I like to structure my classroom and how I believe Leah said earlier, it's really a progression sort of thing. So starting off, with the students getting to know one another, introducing themselves and learning more about, their backgrounds and their experiences really helps for them to have a bigger stake in how you treat people and the emotional ways that you discuss certain things that may actually affect students in the classroom. So building a rapport with them for myself, and then having to build a relationship through the group works that they do throughout the semester, through the partner parent shares that they do. All of these small activities lead up to, when we're talking about more heated conversations or more polarizing debates and conversations. So building that sort of trust amongst myself and amongst them really helps to de-escalate situations when I need to.
Yeah, I fully echo what Verónica said so eloquently. I want to go back to your point, Michelle, that it really helps to remind people, be it abortion rights or be it the Middle East crisis, that these issues have been being discussed for a long time, and we're not going to resolve them today in an undergraduate classroom. Our goal here is to really understand what the different arguments are being made. And it is also difficult. These are difficult conversations to have. Some of us have personal histories, that are connected to conflict, or, families being migrants or refugees, and it's going to affect how we feel about things. And that's okay. The important thing, though, to remember is we are here to learn and understand what these perspectives are, and to stay focused on that. And like Verónica said, I think the immediate management is important, going back to the ground rules. But then there's also that part of sometimes you can only do so much in that moment. And then there are students I'll reach out to afterwards, outside of the classroom, to say, well, let's talk about what happened earlier today. Sometimes it is just, can we think about how in the future, when, I get to that point, this is how I step back, because like Verónica said, we're all human. We're all get there sometimes. And this is what I do. I'm going to take a second. I'm going to breathe. And I might say, okay, could I come back and talk about this in a second? But also sometimes there are just repeat offenders who do name calling, and then that has to be called out, one and a warning be given that, you cannot do this in the classroom, and being very clear on that.
So let's take a step back and think about, you've got a specific class coming up. You anticipate students are going to feel very strongly about this topic. So you've been building up to it. And now it's that abortion conversation, or that foreign policy conversation, or whatever conversation concerns you, or election conversation. And you're anticipating there could be conflict in the classroom, or students who have a very strong visceral reaction to the topic. are there ways you're able to frame the conversation to make it more productive? Are there ways you set it up that makes it more successful? Tavishi?
I'm just going to start by saying it's hard. There's no easy way, right? And even now, 20 years into teaching, there are still days where I have those butterflies in my stomach going, okay, today I know we're going to be talking about nationalism and secession and other types of conflict. And I know Israel and Palestine will come up, and this is going to be an interesting day. So what I like to do is on those days when I know we're going to be discussing that, those difficult subjects, is go in with a plan about sharing history early and, give a clear, as, fact-based as possible, just a clear history of that subject, whatever that might be. That helps people at least get the same foundation on which to build these arguments, right? And even if they haven't done the reading, we hope that they all have, but we know that doesn't stop many of us from speaking up, even if we haven't. So set that initial, background well. Two, I'll share some of my own history, that I am a child of refugees from the India and Pakistan partition. My family itself has been affected by violence. I understand how, it can affect us and affect generations, even when this kind of conflict exists. And it's important that we both understand that, but also try to, separate how we feel from the facts of the situation. Who has power and who doesn't in any given situation. And also set the goals again for the conversation, which is really, let's remember today our goal is understanding, right, the different perspectives on this issue, not about winning an argument, but really just understanding this issue in as many ways as we can.
How do others of you do this?
I would just add, I think a little bit the way that I was trained was, here's all the content of political science, and here's how to be a scholar, and then now go out into the universe and be a teacher. And I'm just going to be honest, I've been doing this for 22 years and never once before I got to the university had any skills training me how to be a teacher. So I would kind of like back up and say, get those trainings, right? Like, so when those even webinars like this that APSA put on, right? I did inclusive training a number of years ago, like those trainings that help us hone our craft. Because I do think that we don't always identify as a teacher. Does that make sense? We identify as a political scientist or whatever discipline or the scholarship that we do. And I will just reveal to you all that the first time someone was mean in my classroom, I kicked everyone out because I literally did not know how to manage what was happening. And I just said, we're all going to leave, goodbye, right? And I went out of that classroom and thought, well, that was a fail. I failed them, I failed myself. And I love what Verónica said earlier. I needed to practice. When that happens, what should I have done? Because clearly my human capacity wasn't up to that challenge in that moment, right? So I would just kind of say, like, backing up and getting some of those pedagogical trainings so you have tools in your tool belt, right? Does that, like, it just kind of helps you build a knowledge base of how to manage things that I don't know that we all necessarily naturally know how to do.
I would just add too that it doesn't hurt before you have it, every time you have a discussion, is just to go over the ground rules very quickly again. Not just, oftentimes, we have them in the syllabus and we go over the first day and then they're never thought about again for the rest of the semester. But if you are kind of practicing what you're preaching, just to bring them out again and kind of have that fresh in people's memories before you launch into discussion.
I think one of the benefits of teaching law and philosophy is I have lots of primary texts. And so I'm able to frame a lot of our discussions around primary texts, court decisions. And so I often frame the conversation around the text itself. So we're not necessarily debating facts, we're relating it to a content. But the other thing I often do is frame the question to be not what do you think about, but how might someone who believes ABC or who holds 1, 2, 3 values react to this issue? And then it gives students just enough of a distance that they feel like they can participate without saying, this is what it is that I think. Instead, it may be what they think, but it gives them at least a little bit of a shelter. And after we've done that 2 or 3 times, it then becomes easier for them to articulate what they believe and why. So I have found that very useful, to just frame it. How might someone who believes in X respond to this issue? So, Ayana?
Yes, and I totally agree. I think a part of that skill building is actually teaching them how to do the skill of finding the evidence, finding the sources, the primary sources, finding the court documents. Where was this decision actually made, and why was this decision made? So everyone has opinions, and we do, a lot of our opinions come from our own personal experiences and in places of, privilege sometimes, but giving them the techniques of where do we find evidence-based resources, where do we find scholarly articles and knowledge, as opposed to op-ed knowledge or newspaper articles, or social media is a really important and large tool and thing in our lives currently. So how do we separate what we hear and see through the media and what we find as scholars and as the experts to be the actual evidence from that? So teaching them how to decipher from the noise.
Well, one last question, then we'll go to the Q&A that's starting to pile up here. How do you perceive your role in the discussion as the professor? And then how do you build this role into your structuring of the course? And talking to people over the years and doing workshops like this, I hear people who see their role as provocateur, or, I tend to see myself more as a conductor. Other people see themselves as a guide. Some follow a pedagogy where they're a fellow student. How do you frame this? And then how is that framing reflected in the way in which you both structure your course and the discussions? Leah?
Yeah, so let me just say again, I consider myself a work in progress, right? So every time I am teaching, I am hopefully getting better at what I'm doing. I think no conversation is final. Nothing I've written is final, right? Like everything is iterative. So to that end, the metaphor that I used to describe myself, so it's different from you, Michelle, because you said you describe yourself as a conductor, but I consider myself a fellow musician. So the metaphor I always use, it's that we are a jazz band and everyone's going to be a soloist at different times. And sometimes we're going to provide, the background music, and sometimes we are a soloist. And I am just one of the people, like a fellow traveler in that band. I will say I do make a distinction. For my intro courses, I'm probably the lead soloist all the time. For my upper division courses, I start as a lead soloist, and as we develop our relationships, I kind of background myself. Does that make sense? So I feel that it tends to flatten the conversation. I had a classroom designed for me as an interactive classroom where the students sit in pods and I am like walking around. So even my classroom design for my upper division, at least, they won't let me do my big intros in there, but in that classroom design is a very we are in the round, having these conversations, doing this work together. We are creating this learning together, creating that knowledge together. And so we're all participants. I don't know if that makes sense, right? So my thing is we are all making that music. And then I love that because when they write their essays or they're writing anything that they're doing, or the content that they ping off of is not always just the book that we've read or the text that we were using or anything that I said. Sometimes they pick up on an undercurrent in a conversation, right? And then they react And it's just lovely. I mean, it's sometimes hard to grade, right? So you got to be really thoughtful about how you're setting that up. But I find those conversations, if I am a work in progress with them, they go really well.
Yeah. I think the trick is figuring out what's authentic to you. And if you pick a role that's not authentic to who you are, that's not going to work.
Oh my gosh, I totally agree, Michelle. No, exactly right. Exactly right.
Other thoughts on this before we open it up?
I was just going to say, yes, I do think of my role differently in that on one hand, I think of it as, I'm a host and I'm hosting this salon. So it
Right.
is at my house. If an altercation breaks out, it is in my house. I am ultimately responsible and my stuff will be broken. So I will pay really close attention and keep reminding people of the rules, but at the same time, I'm a host. So I also have to set an environment that is welcoming and that is safe and where people can have good conversations. And one thing I like to do is a little bit of a joke at the beginning of my comparative politics classes say, we're going to be looking at democracies and dictatorships together. And I'm very much a Democrat at heart, but let's not make any mistake. This is a dictatorship, the class. I will do my best to keep it a benevolent dictatorship, but it is a dictatorship in the end because I am the one responsible to make sure that you actually get the learning that we are here for. So.
Well, we've got a number of interesting questions that we've touched on, but I think are going to push us to go in certain directions. So we have two questions. One is asking, isn't one of the privileges that when we talk about the privilege in the classroom is the privilege to determine and declare the fact and what sources are acceptable? So how do you respond when a student challenges facts, source, and the faculty member's privilege to declare what standards are used? Another question from another participant is, what about when students believe lies? How do we navigate that?
So, go ahead, Verónica. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I teach analysis, the methods course in my department. And I have a lot of students who don't really believe in numbers. And part of that is aided and abetted, no offense, by my political theory scholar who's a bit of a postmodernist and doesn't think you can measure anything, right? So sometimes, and this is a very flip answer, and Verónica will have a much better answer than I have, but I will literally say, if you don't believe we can count things, right? So if you don't believe that we can measure things, I need you to check that disbelief at the door. And here in this space, we are going to engage in a conversation that presumes statistics matters or is a thing that we can all believe in. So sometimes that, Michelle, right? Like I will actually go, this might be tricky for you, right? But in this space, just table that so we can engage in the work that we need to do. And maybe that's not the best answer, but I've used that often as a way to at least get over the initial hump. Did that make sense to get into that conversation? I'm sorry, Verónica.
No, not at all, not at all. That distrust of that you mentioned, that distrust of numbers is real. I'm seeing more and more students that like, unless you're talking to everybody, polling or sample sizes, so like they're not accurate. They could never be representative. So it is I don't know if it's generational or it is something to perhaps talk about or deal with. But another approach that I use is, well, on the first hand, understanding I'm not going to convince that person or change their minds if they believe that so strongly. And I don't necessarily know if that's my role. I think what my role is to teach political science and social science, right? And so if in terms of having that safe environment, if you just immediately say, well, you're wrong and that's a lie, right? Understanding their perspective, they're going to react somehow, right? And that's either going to be with volatility or by shutting down completely. And neither of those are acceptable responses in my educator's notebook. And so I think what can happen from that situation is bringing in the, falling back on the discipline, right? So, okay, that's an interesting idea. What's your source? Show me the evidence. Where do you get this idea from? And in that way, you're challenging them to think, well, where have I heard this? What is the source? I'm just repeating something that I've heard on media. What is that, source of media? Or, so have them engage them in that political science, and it keeps that conversation going a little bit more than if you just immediately say, that's not factual, or that's just, you're misinformed, or that's a lie, because students are going to believe them, right? So you really kind of have to think about how would you approach that so that you are still creating a space where that person can learn, at the same time releasing that low probability that you're probably going to, in that semester, change their mind completely, especially if it's a worldview or a socialization aspect of their lives. I mean, you're really rocking their whole world.
So I have two thoughts on this. One is I teach a 1-hour course, mostly for freshmen, but I've taught it throughout for all students too, is on talking across the political divide. And one of their assignments requires them to kind of look at something they still feel very strongly about and how much they know about it, because it usually shows the stronger you feel about something, it's because the less you know about it. And I had a student who once said there was no evidence, no information, no data that would ever change your mind on an issue. And that was very revealing to me. And I've now used that as kind of a test for students who, or even those people who walk in off the street and want to have conversations with me in my office. Is there any evidence? Is there any data? Is there any information that would change your mind on this issue? And if the answer is no, then what we're really talking about is an article of faith, as opposed to an interpretation. That's something different, and that's okay. But now we're having a different kind of conversation. And that has been really helpful in navigating when you get to that point with someone, that we're really talking about is an article of faith here. And so, because this is how you've built your worldview. And we're in this classroom doing something a little different. So you and I need to continue this conversation outside of class. I think the other thing that often, well, I'll come back to that later. Anybody else on this, and I'll move to the next question.
I think at the heart of this is also what we're seeing, as a society post the pandemic, which is a questioning of the scientific process itself, seen in, why do I need to use a mask? Why do I need to get the vaccine? So that's sort of really stuck with me more recently, about going back to explaining what the scientific process is as often as possible in every classroom, and how peer-reviewed articles are different from a news article or a weblog, why it's important that we look at those, and also ultimately how science progresses is a preponderance of evidence in a certain direction. And so even just going online and finding an article that supports your view, confirmation bias, isn't actually a true faith, good faith participation in the scientific process. So just going back to that, I find helps, sort of bring people back a little bit. Okay, this is a classroom. What we're doing here is different. And yes, it is a privilege, but that privilege comes from an education about the scientific process. So the best we can do is share that understanding as openly and as often as we can, so that more of us engage with that, versus kind of just be okay with not remembering or knowing that.
I think framing your class as that process of determining what you believe and why, as opposed to focusing on where they end up. I always tell them the first day of class, in every class, I have no interest in your opinions, none. Really don't care about your opinion at all, which horrifies them, because they've been taught their opinion is a very special and important thing. But what I am endlessly and continuously fascinated by is their analysis, how they got there, what led them to the conclusions they come to, the information they use, the worldview framing, the value system that helped interpret it. And I always tell them, and this frees you because you don't have to worry about trying to guess what my opinion is, because I'll happily tell you, but I don't care. I'm really interested in how you get there. And that seems to take some of the heat out of the room. Because then we're focusing on how do you explain it and how do you understand it, as opposed to what is it you believe. Our next question is a professor who's teaching only freshman students in large Intro to American Government classes that are required by many of the states for students to complete. And they're wondering if you have any particular advice is how to address students who do not want to have a productive and constructive discussion about political science topics because they don't even want to be there. How do you navigate that?
For me, I like to try and connect these broad political debates and themes to their everyday life and their current happenings, things that are important to them, things that they do care about. Even we had like a discussion or a lecture on relationships within, the college community and how we talked about themes that came up with violence and all kind of stuff, but relating it to what was actually important to them and what they can really find useful, I find to be an engaging strategy that gets everybody excited about the conversation and riled up.
I think figuring out their majors ahead of time and trying to find examples that connect. If you have a lot of nurses, pulling it into healthcare, if you have a lot of business people, I mean, depending on what the majority of them are, finding ways of kind of targeting those career goals seem to kind of help. And we're probably the easiest discipline to do that with, so.
I think for large intro courses in particular, smaller group discussions, right? Not necessarily trying to have this as a whole thing, but really breaking them down into smaller groups, still giving them really clear instructions. But I think it becomes easier for more people to speak up when they're just relating to their peers. And I find that sometimes it's helpful to keep the same small groups throughout the semester, just in a very practical, thing, because then they get to know each other. They've developed some trust with each other, and then they're more likely to be able to feel comfortable having these more difficult conversations, and also realize that it's because we're building skills through this process that are important professional and social skills.
I think especially when they're conversations designed to solve a problem, to come to a conclusion, to synthesize, that there's a project they're doing in their small groups, not just now talk amongst yourselves, but you're giving them something to come up with. So they're working towards a goal. That I find that is really helpful as well.
I think the thing I might add is the use of a learning management system. So I don't teach online asynchronous classes generally, but I use our Canvas system. So when we do the small groups, there is an assignment attached to that conversation that's a discussion thread, right? So they are not just reporting out in the classroom, because sometimes that's just terrifying, but it's like, okay, after class, right? However this went, here are 3 questions you need to answer based on what you saw. And I find that helps also for me for the grading, right? Because it gives me something tangible that I can go, okay, like they were in the room, they talked about this. Anyway, I find like that, just using those technological tools can be helpful.
And then we have someone in the talk who notes that we've talked a lot about de-escalation strategies, but fairly generally. And they would like to know some concrete, specific de-escalation strategies that we find useful in the classroom.
I guess I can start with that one since I brought the general idea up. you will find what works for you, what you're comfortable with, but you're going to want to, interrupt if you need to, and create a pause. And so that pause can be just asking everyone to be quiet for 10, 15 seconds. You could have them do 3 deep breaths that you could lead them in. But you're going to want to interrupt the escalating emotion and re-regulate their brain. And so, what those techniques are should be what you're comfortable doing. Some things that I've learned from my kids, seeing them go through K through 12, they often have, it's amazing how the students respond to the teachers, but, they'll clap 3 times and then the students stop whatever they're doing immediately and they'll clap 3 times, right? You can have a phrase that you might say in a higher volume that indicates to students that we're going to pause. Those are some specific things that I've used in the past, but I know that not everyone's comfortable, for example, leading, deep breathing techniques or something like that. So find what works for you. But the big goal is to get control of the conversation and create a pause so that people's brains are moving from the emotional side to the rational side.
I'll just say being a younger professor and oftentimes having to have a very strong voice coming into the classroom because some of the students confuse, like, is she the student or the professor? Like sometimes I like to make a joke where I'll just sit in the front of the class on the first day and then they'll be like, where's the professor? And like see if they say anything crazy or if they know, like they notice like, oh yeah, she's a professor. But again, going back to when I have to de-escalate situations and making sure that I have that strong presence and they understand that yes, this is a space for you to feel comfortable in, but it's also a space where everyone should feel comfortable in. So if I need to, I will stop a conversation mid talk. Like we're no longer discussing this. We're going to pivot to X, Y, and Z, and being assertive in that when I need to, so it doesn't get to a place where we can't come back from. But yes.
I think it's also useful, at least for me, is that when there's something like that said and it becomes heated, is to say, wow, we're seeing in real life a tension that exists in political discourse, and then re-articulate the 2 different points of view and show how they, not pointing it at the individual who said it, but how the content of that information represents these 2 different worldviews. And then we can start breaking down the conflict between the worldviews and where that may come from. Then the students don't feel like they have somehow are going to do the walk of shame out of the building when you're done, but they're also able to see the content of what they said maybe implied things they didn't intend for it to imply. And that has been useful because it keeps people discussing. And again, I'm not freaking out. Any other thoughts come to mind or resources there? Okay. Then we had another question from someone who wanted to know, how do we deal with students who have strong opinions but are not able to express themselves well rhetorically? How do we engage them and pull them into the conversation?
I do think, like, I would echo what Tavishi said earlier, and that is building those relationships outside of the classroom. Does that make sense? So, right. So you build that bridge, and then you can help draw them in when I don't want to say appropriate because I don't mean that, but like when you feel like this would work, and help them have those conversations. I don't know if you would agree, Tavishi, but like that's what I was thinking was those are where the work happens outside of the dynamic of the classroom, maybe.
Yes, thank you, Leah. I fully agree. I think the other thing I find useful is that, um, I was that uncomfortable student who was really not wanting to speak up. I'd be very happy. I had lots of opinions, but I'd like to keep them to myself. I know it's hard to believe today, guys, but that was the case once. But I make sure that everybody does speak up, whether they want to or not. And sometimes that's in the form of a presentation after small group discussions. So everyone has to do that. And I found that over time, just coming up and stating, facts or whatever those takeaways are from those small group discussions helps students overcome that fear, that initial very large wall that, we create in our minds, and helps them build a little bit of confidence. And then there are some where I use Padlet, instead of the discussion tool in D2L. I just find that it looks good. It looks a little bit like Facebook does. And so students kind of enjoy that. And if I see people who seem to express themselves rather well in writing, but don't speak up in class, I'll make it a point to reach out to them and say, I really enjoyed what you said. I wish you'd share more, because I think you have really important, valuable things to say, or your experience, living in country X is something that would be so helpful for us to understand this issue better from your lived experience. So please do share. And sometimes I'll call on them as well, saying, you said that you've lived in X country, what was your experience in observing, as an observer of what was happening around?
I think another common situation is if someone has strong opinions and they're trying to express them, but they might not be doing a good job at it, that you can really serve as a facilitator for that expression and ask clarifying questions. So, let me just make sure I understand you correctly. You're saying X, Y, and Z, or your key points that I'm taking away are X, Y, and Z. Is that correct? And just trying to kind of bring what they're saying to that next level so they can continue with their expression. So that's not uncommon, especially if you have a lot of first generation international students, for example, where English might not be their first language. And so it, I think, is another way to build trust and kind of keep that learning environment, but also encourage them to communicate even more.
One of our participants wanted us to know that they found it useful to read research from the Gottman Institute on things like flooding and stonewalling, as well as assumptions, I'm guessing from both students and faculty, about the purpose and result of discussion. For some people, especially for students, they think a discussion is just talking, or it's competitive debate. I have to win and prove everybody else wrong. And so she's pointing to the Gottman, Gottman Institute, as having useful sources and useful research to help us think about how students are thinking about discussions, as opposed to how we're thinking about discussions, and that we need to find ways of bridging that difference. And then one other person noted, is it a coincidence that the panelists are female? And are these pedagogical strategies gendered? So I don't think I think the reason why we're female is I know there was at least one man invited who did not respond. So,
I love that question, actually. So part of me wants to say, well, I hope if we were all male presenting that the question would be asked as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I do want to mention, besides that these pedagogical strategies are not gendered,
I don't think
is
so.
that the reality is, though, that female professors, BIPOC professors, and female BIPOC professors, research shows, are challenged more in classes. So anticipating that and thinking about classroom management, given your demographics and the context of your students, having these techniques and these skills might be used more often when there's a female presenting professor than not, right? So gender does matter.
But I don't think I think these techniques can be kind of broadly used. But again, I think it's finding what works authentically for you. Because otherwise you're just playing a role and it's not going to be successful. So one last thing, we've got about a little less than 10 minutes left. What is your best hard-earned advice for a meaningful discussion of difficult topics? If you had to kind of distill it to kind of one takeaway for our audience, what would you recommend, or what are you thinking about? Ayana.
I would say that's a very good question. A one takeaway I would say is make space for all of your students and take space to be the leader of the conversation in the classroom.
Leah?
Yeah, again, I would just say, had the hard conversation not be the first time they're hearing their voice in the classroom, right? So I would echo Ayana right from the beginning, building your syllabus in such a way does that, that everyone knows that this is the expectation. I think just prevention, right, just really helps a lot.
Okay. Verónica?
Yeah, I would say to make sure at the beginning of the semester that I think, that comment about the Gottman Institute is really important, to have that conversation with your students about what's the purpose of discussion in your course, and how this is not debates or, these other forms of interactions. And for me, that is learning from one another. And so given that goal, just reminding students that most of us are not bad people and we're coming from a good space, and to give each other the benefit of the doubt, and to be able to learn from each other perspectives, and to kind of keep that mindset throughout all the different discussions that we might have in the course.
And I think I would encourage us to think about how all of our pedagogy leads to this and leads to these conversations. So for instance, giving, the idea of intellectual growth and experimentation being a value. So students have the ability to rewrite and rethink and change their mind. And that's modeled and demonstrated. And so we have the iterations of our ideas. I think about the way we ask questions. I sit in and watch a lot of newer faculty teach, and I see two big mistakes. One is often asking rhetorical questions just as a habit, and students get into the habit of just not connecting with the rhetorical question. So when a real question is asked or real discussion is wanted, students have been socialized to be silent because they don't think it's not real. And so really kind of eliminating those rhetorical questions from our teaching. And then the other one is fishing questions. A lot of people ask questions that are designed to elicit particular, concrete, discrete answers. And again, what happens is students learn very quickly that the odds are they're going to be wrong. It's not going to be what the professor is looking for. And so they're not going to play. And then when you're ready to have a real discussion, that trust hasn't been built. So it is, I think, thinking about how all of our techniques kind of lead to the potential to have these kinds of real conversations. Any other last thoughts? Well, I want to thank our panelists. I saw Tavishi had slipped out or got dumped, I'm not sure. But I want to thank Ayana, Verónica, Leah for being here, participating in this conversation, for this robust audience for joining us, and those who are going to be watching. I hope we have a very successful fall. People say to me all the time, political science, that must be exciting to teach right now. And the reality is it's exciting to teach all the time. So maybe an exciting semester for us all and a successful one. Thank you very much.